I don't think I've ever paid so much attention to trees as I have done over the past couple of months. We've been doing a lot of walking, and whilst walking I've been noticing the trees coming into bud and then into leaf and trying to remember the different species. I haven't, however, as yet started dreaming about trees. Which brings us to the book of Daniel. Stories, prophecies and strange events from the time of the Babylonian exile. Stories recorded to encourage the exiles during their time in captivity. Stories told to encourage the exiles to patiently endure during their time as strangers in a strange land. And chapter 4 of the book of Daniel centres around another dream that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has. A dream about a tree. If you haven't read chapter 4, it might be worth pausing and doing that now, as I'm going to be referring to it but not actually reading it. Chapter 4 of Daniel is a story told in flashback, based, at least superficially, on a dream about a tree. The chapter 4, begins with Nebuchadnezzar issuing a proclamation about Daniel's God, Yahweh. Nebuchadnezzar then goes on to explain how he got to the point of praising Daniel's God and issuing this proclamation. In chapter 4 then, Nebuchadnezzar sets out and explains the detail of the dream he's had. He explains the interpretation provided once again by Daniel. He explains the way in which his dream comes true, the king's mental breakdown, and he recounts his restoration and his acknowledgement of Yahweh, Daniel's God. What's happened before then? Daniel interpreted the king's previous dream, the one about the statue. In response to Daniel interpreting that dream, Nebuchadnezzar praised Daniel and his God. But then he had a statue made for everybody to worship. Nebuchadnezzar's respect for Daniel and his God appeared to have been short-lived. This account in chapter 4 supports this, as we'll see shortly. In this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar seems to be telling the story himself. It's largely his words. In the last chapter, chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar started by issuing a proclamation requiring everyone to worship an idol. In this chapter, Nebuchadnezzar starts by issuing another proclamation, but this time it's in regard to Daniel's God, Yahweh. And if you read it, the statement is quite something for a pagan king to acknowledge a God, the one true God, even though perhaps he's done it to a degree before. But here he's putting this into an official proclamation, an official announcement, a message for the whole world, he says. It maybe indicates that he thinks quite highly of himself and his empire. Why the change in Nebuchadnezzar? Well, because of the experience that he has just come through. Let's look at the experience the king has had. The king has had another of his dreams, another disturbing dream, one that he says terrified him. He tries to get the dream interpreted, but again it requires Daniel's intervention. The dream centres on a large tree in the middle of the earth, tall and strong, fruitful, providing shade, providing rest, feeding all the world. A messenger arrives and orders the tree's destruction. Branches to be lopped off, fruit scattered, animals chased away. But the stump is to be left in place. And if you notice in verse 15, the description changes from a tree to a person. Let him be drenched in dew. Let him live with wild animals and have the mind of wild animals. It seems clear that the dream wasn't really about a tree. It was about a person. And I suspect the king had a suspicion who that person might be. And I suspect that's why he was terrified. I wonder too if the king's advisors had a good idea what the dream meant, but were reluctant to say that to the king. But not Daniel. Daniel knows, and Daniel, perhaps reluctantly at first, tells the king the meaning of the dream. The dream is indeed about the king and what is about to befall him. And it's not good news. Although Daniel doesn't chicken out of giving the king the interpretation, he does it gently. We're told he was frightened by the meaning and overcome for a while. Daniel tells the king the fate that's about to befall him, but although this spells disaster for the king, the enemy really, Daniel appears concerned for the king, worried about him. Daniel is clearly fond of this, perhaps in some ways, despotic king. And although the dream suggests the king is about to be deposed and live like an animal, be driven from human society, Daniel offers the king some advice. Daniel suggests that if the king stops sinning and does what is right, breaks with his wicked past and is merciful to the poor, he may continue to prosper. He may avoid his fate. Maybe Daniel was simply trying to soften the blow. How many of us would be brave or wise enough to offer such advice to someone so powerful? Let's go back for a moment to the start of the account of the dream. In verse 4, the king tells us that he was, at the time he had the dream, living in my palace in comfort and prosperity. What does this say to us? Things were going well for the king. He was prospering. He was at the peak of his power. He was comfortable. He was secure, or so he thought. And it's a warning, not just about the dangers of not being righteous and just. It's a warning about being complacent, about thinking we're sorted, about being too comfortable. We can be vulnerable when things are going well. We can be vulnerable when we are comfortable. We're vulnerable when we're complacent. It's when we're living in comfort and prosperity that we can succumb to sin and temptation, to illness. We can have our heads turned by, well, just about anything, I guess. A pretty face, the possibility of an easy buck. You know, someone perhaps offers us a really good business opportunity, but it's not entirely legit, or it would involve someone being done over in the deal, someone being cheated. And our heads can be turned. And it's so easy for the rest of us to follow, to turn from God to something that takes God's place. The Bible calls this sin or idolatry. It's the same thing really, sin and idolatry. Something that takes God's place. And it's so easy for that to happen. And perhaps especially when things are going well and we're perhaps off guard, we're perhaps complacent. When we're feeling comfortable and living well, at least in worldly terms. Maybe some of us were in this place a couple of months ago. Things were going well, it seemed. We were comfortable, we were complacent. And then, bang, coronavirus, lockdown, loss of income, loss of freedom, perhaps loss of health, loss of purpose even. Nebuchadnezzar then, after introducing this dream, in his own words then he relates the story of how the dream came true. We find it in verses 28 to 33. God humbles the great King Nebuchadnezzar, the king suffers a mental breakdown. The king loses his mind and his kingdom. He loses his self-respect, he loses his sanity, and he ends up living with wild animals and eating grass. And none of us are immune to this, to mental or physical illness that can rob us of our health, our wealth, our peace of mind, rob us of potentially everything except God. For Nebuchadnezzar, this loss is for 7 seasons or 7 periods of time, maybe 7 years. 7, of course, is significant in Jewish thought as being representing perfection. So perhaps 7 seasons is simply the right length of time for Nebuchadnezzar to go through this. For us, if we suffer in this way, it may be for a season, but that season may be short or it may be long. But ultimately, God will restore us. Although it might not be in this lifetime. The king's loss is not the end of the story. In verses 34 to 37, Nebuchadnezzar recounts briefly how his sanity was restored, and along with that, his power and his kingdom. There's not really suggestion in the story that he repented as such. All it does say he was humbled. This restoration was by the grace of God. It was unearned, it was undeserved. God had taken away or allowed Nebuchadnezzar to lose everything, but now God restores. All God's doing, all God's grace. What then is the overall message of Daniel chapter 4? What would it have had to say to those in exile at the time? And what does it have to say to us today in our strange time? It's a very simple but powerful message. God is in charge. God appoints and God removes. Does he though? Perhaps he allows. It's difficult to say God appointed Hitler or God appointed Saddam Hussein, but he allowed them to hold temporary power. Did God remove them? Or were they removed by people acting on behalf of God, whether they realised they were acting on God's behalf or not? Remember from last time how God can and does use those who don't profess faith in him or even believe in him to carry out his purposes. So God is in charge whether we realise it or not. He humbles the proud, which is pretty much what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And this story would have been a real encouragement to the exiles in captivity in Babylon and later to those struggling to rebuild Jerusalem when they returned from exile. And even later it would have encouraged those in the time of Jesus struggling against Roman oppression and occupation. But there is perhaps another message here for us, and maybe more pertinent because we kind of know God's in charge, don't we? The Israelites in exile in Babylon needed to hear that message, and maybe we do too. Maybe especially when it seems people have no regard for God, no respect for him or his creation. When we feel alienated, when we feel like strangers in a strange land. When we feel like everything's up in the air, everything is uncertain, everything is strange. But the other message, perhaps the more pertinent message, is in the form of a warning about complacency. Beware of thinking we've got there, that we've arrived. Like the guy who built bigger barns that Jesus spoke about, built bigger barns to store all his goods, all his crops, and he said to himself, sit back, take it easy. Like Nebuchadnezzar before the dream, comfortable and prospering. And perhaps in a physical sense, this is not so much of a risk for us now. If we didn't know before March, we know now just how fragile things are physically, our health, our income, all those sort of things. But are we comfortable in our faith? Are we perhaps guilty of thinking we're doing okay faith-wise? We've got there. I wonder if we're sometimes guilty of focusing too on people getting to make a commitment to give their lives to Christ as if that were the purpose and goal of our mission, when that should never be the end point. It should always be merely the starting point. Our mission is to make disciples. Our mission is to teach people to follow Jesus. Deciding to follow is the first step, not the last. I sometimes get frustrated by testimonies that spend maybe 80 or 90% of the time explaining how the person got to the point of accepting Christ, of making a commitment, and then just 10 or 20% on how following Jesus has gone and is going for them since. Now that's okay if someone has made that decision to follow Jesus in recent weeks or months, but not when they made that decision 5, 10, 40 years ago. But could this also be a message, a warning to the church? Don't get complacent. Don't look and think we're doing okay. At Chipping in recent years, we've seen signs of growth. We've had lots of young people, meaning, we think as a church we have a future. We've had sound teaching. We've had good worship. God can and might take that away. And maybe for us, in a sense, he already has done. God might humble us if we don't humble ourselves. And he might humble us even if we are humble. We should always be careful not to take the credit for what God has done. So, who do we identify with in this story from Daniel chapter 4? The king, King Nebuchadnezzar, or Daniel? Daniel, who, along with thousands of others, was living as a stranger in a strange land, far from home, unable to worship or live in freedom, hundreds of miles from the temple in Jerusalem, oppressed but faithful, clinging to God and trusting in his goodness, his love to see him through, knowing that despite appearances, God was in charge. God was pulling the strings, allowing tyrants to hold power, to hold the upper hand, but just for a time. But knowing that in the end, God would put things right. God would restore all things. God would deal with injustice. If we're like that, we identify with Daniel, we need to be prepared to carry on, to patiently endure what we're going through. Or are we a bit like the king Nebuchadnezzar, comfortable and prospering, comfortable in our faith, not really challenged or challenging ourselves, maybe turning a blind eye to injustice, the cry of the poor and the dispossessed, happy with our success, either in our personal or business lives or in our church? If so, we need to beware. May God bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. Amen.